Hello and welcome to the Out of the Lab podcast, where we discuss the operational challenges in cell and gene therapy. Each episode, we sit down with a different voice in the space, from executives and scientists to patients and advocates, to figure out exactly where the industry is breaking down and how to fix it. This episode is brought to you by Method Made. Accelerate your tech transfer by up to 6 months using video SOPs to capture technical nuance. Take the complete interactive product tour at methodmade.ca. Last thing before we get started, quick shout out to the executive producer, Tatiana Matviva, for her work in guest selection and topic choice. Today I'm joined with Mehran, consultant in cell and gene therapy, specializing in the supply chain. Mehran, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Nico. And I'm really glad you reached out and looking forward to what we get on about today.
Awesome. Well, to sort of start the conversation, what I'd like to talk about today is about resilience in the drug development pipeline for cell and gene therapy products. And there's a lot of different facets to this. So maybe to start with, what do you see as an interesting sort of starting point there?
And before we get into the whole because I just recently wrote a white paper about this. So I have a particular perspective, but you have had multiple different guests on the show. So I would be curious where you see as what's the source of who owns resilience? Where does it come from?
Yeah, absolutely. So from my conversations, one of the key, I think there's many different places where resilience comes into play and sort of cracks along the way in the drug development pipeline. But the one that I talk the most about with people is around technology transfer and the operational challenges of getting these amazing scientific discoveries out of universities and research labs into manufacturing and through clinical trials so they can, be used after manufacturing to actually help people.
I don't know whether I'm just glad to hear that my take is not necessarily the most common one, or whether that's more alarming than I would be than it should be. But yes, those are absolutely challenges along the development pipeline. But the way I see it is, if I look at who owns resilience, because resilience often pops up with supply chain, which is kind of where my background aligns, right? But to me, resilience really falls at the intersection of CMC, drug development, so process development, and supply chain. And even going further before tech transfer becomes a thing, right? The way I see it is a little bit that we usually have process development and CMC doing their thing, right? We do, the process gets decided, the bill of materials is being chosen, materials are being selected, to a certain degree, partners are being decided, right? And if you think about it, who in a commercial setting, who is an expert in partner selection, partner due diligence, material pricing, material availability, right? Yes, that's supply chain, but the decisions are already made years in advance, right?
Right.
And so while the default to supply chain is the one who owns resilience and how can we optimize it and all of that stuff, if you really want to make an impact to that, you really need to go earlier in the process, maybe get a perspective from someone who does these things or is potentially going to own these things in the future. And if they can review potentially or just support or provide their input. It's not about changing responsibilities, because CMC and process development, no supply chain guy could do that. That's why these functions exist separately. Everybody has their expertise, right? And that's exactly my point. So why not bring those expertise in to do strategic reviews? It doesn't have to be someone going through the whole process or changing responsibilities, but that's where it starts, right? And this is more general. This has nothing to do with cell and gene therapy. And then you look at cell and gene therapy, where your whole supply chain ends up being the product, right? As you know, if the wrong product goes to the wrong patient, that's a disaster. If the wrong product gets mislabeled or is processed incorrectly, that's a disaster, right? So the supply chain and the resilience of that supply chain, if that's baked in before you can actually impact it, that's where a lot of the resilience challenges also come from, right?
So it sounds like sort of upstream, like when we're talking about resilience and the consequences we see, those are sort of downstream, but it sounds like upstream from those, partner selection is one of these sort of deciding factors that if you stack the cards correctly and put the puzzle together in the right way at the beginning, you can avoid or at least mitigate some of these risks down the line.
Absolutely. And I mean, we have grown from where cell and gene was when I started 8 years ago, right? At that time, you didn't have all the options that we have today. You have a CDMO that's pretty much the only one potentially in your area who could do it, right? So at that stage, it's not necessarily saying, oh, we could or should choose someone else. It's more understanding, can they operate at a commercial scale, for example, or can they even do this? And if not, if you recognize that risk 5 years before launch, you can maybe do something about it, right? Co-development, process improvements, plethora of things. If you only recognize that close to launch, then you end up with not just one tech transfer, which is from the university to the CDMO. You need to potentially delay your launch, do tech transfers away from them, which also comes with stability testing and a lot of other testings, because the FDA wants to see, can you do, one-to-one process transfers, assuming you own the process. If you don't own the process, you're married to that CDMO if the filing includes that, right? And that's really where it comes from. It's either the recognition of, should we pick someone else, right? Do a different lens of partner selection, or okay, that's the only choice we have, but how can we optimize and mitigate before it's too late, right? And I don't generally like throwing around numbers, but recently there was research that I saw that showed within, I think, the CRLs or the FDA critical response letters, I think about, if I remember correcting, 40% are usually manufacturing related, right? And out of those, to a big chunk are CDMO caused.
Yeah.
Right. So somewhere either it's with the CDMOs that we're missing something, or it's with the selection process or the optimization, but there is a gap clearly within the process, right? And this also is demonstrated later on by saying that about 1 in 16, if therapies fail, and not due to the science. The 1 in 16 failure comes from these kinds of failures, manufacturing, quality issues. And for depending on what company you're looking at, you may not be able to absorb that, right? And it's a shame if you miss out on a therapy just because we couldn't make it work because of the, I would call it supply chain, like, just in a broader context, right? If the supply chain doesn't work out.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Now, you mentioned about owning the process. This is something that's come up in a few conversations. I'm going to be honest, I don't really know what that means. What do we really mean when we're talking about like the asset owner or the CDMO owning the process, and what are the kind of implications there?
So it's let me rephrase that, right? In certain cases, like big pharma, we have the bigger players. They tend to have their own processes that either for capacity enhancement or they need additional capacity, you would get extra floor space at a CDMO who can run your process, but you just run it or outsource it to be ran at some other place, right? And connecting it to resilience and supply chain quite nicely. For example, the apheresis process, a lot of companies, they let the apheresis centers or the cell centers just do their process, do the apheresis, store the material, and then ship it to you. To control variability, J&J opted a different route. They chose to do their own process, tech transfer that to all the apheresis sites, and have that one process, how they then cryopreserved the cells and then shipped it towards their processing and manufacturing facilities, right? That, of course, introduced other challenges that we did overcome, one of them being materials, because everybody was then after the same materials for the same process, and some had priority, some didn't have priority, because then you're competing with each other for your own processes at the end of the day. So our workaround was to work with our network, supply network, to come up with a system where we could be seen as one unit, right? Not just be competing. So it was easier and better to allocate resources and products and materials across the network. But that's an example of the implication of tech transfer if you have your own process versus if someone has their own process, right? So it's harder to move away from a partner if you're using their process, especially if that's already part of the filing.
Mhm.
If it's your own process, then the real discussion is around tech transfer and being able to show that there is comparability, that the process is now someone else's, or you moved it to someone else, sorry, and the result is the same, right? But if they own the process, then you're tied to them.
Mhm. Yeah, well, it sort of sounds like you get a little bit of leverage and independence if you own the process as the sponsor, because you fundamentally understand how it works, and you could, switch down the line, whether that means you're breaking up with that CDMO or just if you need like increased capacity. But it does create a sort of bit of a strange situation if maybe you hire a smaller CDMO, suddenly you need a whole bunch of new capacity and you don't really understand. It makes it a bit of a black box, I guess.
Yeah. But it's also beyond the black box, how willing is that CDMO to give their process knowledge to other players, right? But do they want to do an internal expansion, or because it's also in their interest to keep that knowledge to themselves?
Yeah. Yeah, that sort of makes quite a bit of sense. So I'm curious. We've talked a bit about CDMOs and the actual tech transfer there. Now, what about on the sort of supply chain side about the actual supplies? So there's like multiple factors here. There's the CROs, CDMOs, these various subcontractors involved. And then there's the actual materials. They're coming from patients. Yeah, what are your thoughts on some of the vulnerabilities in that sort of regard?
Right. So yeah, the CDMOs are often your pass through, right? They have their own supply network, depending on how much of the process they're handling. For bigger pharma, they often are the process manufacturers, and the big pharma companies tend to have input into the supply, right? The material supply. For small biotechs who maybe don't have the expertise in-house, they tend to then also rely heavily on these CDMOs and their supply chain and procurement expertise. In terms of challenges, I'm going to connect. Let's start from the where we started, right? Where does resilience start? It's at the end of the day, you need to design your product around resilience. Otherwise, you don't really get a resilient process, product, and delivery after you commercialize, right? And what does that mean? There's this concept that, especially within procurement and supply chain, where you have addressable, they call it addressable spend, and non-addressable spend, right? It's not necessarily just about where you're spending money. What this implies is non-addressable are materials that are either hard to touch. You can't change suppliers, you can't change whatever, and it could be just because the IP is owned by your partner. It could be because they're explicitly mentioned in the regulatory filing, right? It could be because they're custom-made materials that you can just get from one person, and a lot of other reasons, right? And what that does is, and on average, if you look at the industry, not just in cell and gene therapy, 42% of materials are locked in that, right?
Okay.
The commercial supply chain is usually already playing with the other half of materials that you can impact, right? Where you're trying to get price efficiencies, improve cost of goods. If you have supply reliability issues, those are the ones where you can, quote unquote, easily make changes. Whereas the other 40-50%, you're either going to have to do a refiling or do a lot of process changes to make that transfer. If it's a complete partner change, or you have to upgrade your partner because you can't move away from them, right? And this is what I mean by resilience starts at the design. You may not be able to reduce that number for 42% heavily, because you will have some things that go through filing or that are IP dependent, but you can potentially optimize them upfront, right? And that's what I mean, again, going back to the whole, you design resilience into your product, not later on.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. And so it sounds like it's really about sort of commodification. There's a huge amount of these things that are not commodities. And yeah, maybe for an audience of early stage asset developers, I think you briefly mentioned them, but maybe we could just talk a little about at a high level, what are some of these factors? So I guess there's intellectual property. What are these, some of these deciding factors that separate these two groups of the commodities and not?
I think more than just commodities, there's also this element of your approach to materials, right? And again, this is not about if someone is doing it right or wrong. Everybody has a different purview, perspective, and at the end of the day, job, right? If you're doing a process development and you're a process development, or you're an engineer, your goal is to get the process done most efficiently.
Right.
And you're going to use the materials that fit your process, right? Or you're going to look for those materials. And here, and don't quote me on the exact numbers, but an interesting example actually from my day at J&J, no, what, 6 years ago maybe. So I kind of forced my way as commercial supply chain into the R&D pipeline, because it was within J&J. It was still kind of a biotechy environment, right? There was this whole agreement on the Legend Biotech, and it was just me and my manager. We were doing end-to-end procurement, supply chain, all of it, right? And once I forced my way into the pipeline, so beyond Carvicti, I came in there with the excuse of, hey, we're trying to do a category, a strategy around the whole platform. I want to just look at what you have in the bill of materials, what materials you're using, and what we can leverage with what we have already for Carvicti, right? And what we noticed, so I brought along someone from quality as well, and what we noticed was they were using, let's say, 50 ml syringe, right? And I'm sure J&J buys those in tons, but just the volume they had specifically, we didn't buy those, right? J&J didn't have those in the commercial network, and they needed them in maybe like a couple hundred per month, right? So me and the quality colleague, we looked at each other and we were like, maybe you want to use 100 ml syringe with the right delineations. You still get your volume, you still have the 150 or whatever, and we buy them in tons across J&J, not just for this facility. And if you are ever short, hard to get them, just pop up over across the street and you can get them from our own inventory, right, at J&J. And it's like thoughts or things like that, which you may not think as a process engineer. You don't have to. And that's my whole argument. You don't have to. It should not be your responsibility. But if you get that kind of a perspective, there's optimizations that you can do, right? It's easy to say, oh, I need a bioreactor with so a single-use bioreactor with these knobs and these temperature probes and whatnot, with these films, because that's what your process needs, instead of seeing what the catalog exists and maybe just get something off the shelf which is slightly different than what you need. And sometimes that's not the option, right? But then it's a risk that you've understood and deliberately taken, rather than then realizing years after that, oh, maybe you could have done that. And we faced that in COVID, right? We were developing Carvicti during COVID, and because it was not a drug that was commercial yet, the US legally was not prioritizing supply, right? Everything that was commercial, all the supply got priority. So we had a lot of instances we found these things and we tried to mitigate them because we hadn't filed yet. So we still had that flexibility. I even led a whole project to harmonize as much as possible the manufacturing process in Raritan for some active APIs and Switzerland, because they were doing the same product at a different scale, but the materials were completely different, right? The process had variations, and then you wonder, why did we have to do that? And after the harmonization process, we were able to exchange materials, because sometimes in Europe you were able to get materials, bags, bioreactors, assemblies that you at that time weren't able to get in the US. So we could do internal transfers and manage production a lot more efficiently. And yes, that's a bigger network, a bigger player potentially that a small biotech might not have to worry about. But especially in cell therapy, if you're looking ahead and you have a center in the US, you will potentially have a manufacturing site in Europe. This becomes more and more important, right?
Yeah. So the next thing that comes to mind for me is like talking about resilience and harmonization and standardization. What's the sort of impact on supply chain risk there, or just risk in general, when as a larger company or a network, you can standardize a process, like you mentioned in the story with J&J, and you can do the same thing in various places? How does that sort of impact?
I mean, there's the geographic risk that you obviously spread across the globe. I mean, we're seeing different things right now. A lot of people are now trying to move production back into the US because there's more favorable terms now, right, in the US to do manufacturing at home. There's this whole concept of most favored nation, which is throwing, I wouldn't say necessarily a wrench into everything, but it's a different approach now. If this goes through, depending on what the actual numbers are going to be at the end of the year, you actually have to change your pricing strategies to a certain degree, right? Which puts a lot more pressure on your supply chain and where you source items from, where manufacturing is happening, and how things are moving. Based on the reading that I've done so far, it does apply mostly to the finished good, as my understanding. But again, obviously that's a developing story right now, and we'll know more later this year. But you can spread with multiple locations your risk from that perspective. You have political risks and geopolitics that's happening all of these days, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean you need to rely on your own network, right? CDMOs these days have wide networks across the world, depending on how big they are. So it comes back to early on knowing what your situation is and then planning accordingly on how this is going to look like commercially. A first-time biotech sometimes doesn't have the runway to take those. They're in survival mode day in, day out. But some of these do benefit because, like I said, if 1 in 17 drug fails because not all the science, but these things, that's your biotech, that's your company,
Yeah.
right? For bigger companies, they have a bigger appetite for risk because, well, they're not dependent most of the times on one drug.
Yeah. So the sort of volume and the size of the development pipeline really makes an impact there.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked quite a bit about CDMOs and the sort of the resilience and risks there. I'm also curious about research organizations, CROs. How do they fit into this?
I mean, from a buyer's perspective, CROs are obviously a very crucial partner, especially early on in the development. A lot of the analytics and things like that get outsourced to them, and they, depending on what testing is being done, they can be big bottlenecks, right? And I know that's where your whole clinical supply and the CMC teams actually come in, and they optimize and work closely with these partners to manage those pipelines. But again, the effect, those are sometimes better managed in that sense because those teams are usually the ones who generally interact with those, right? They're familiar with the test, the process, it's the analytics. It's really the players or the responsibilities that get handed off or that are someone else's who isn't in the room that get decided earlier on, right? Supply issues and challenges are always going to be a thing. None of the discussion that we're having today that means there's no supply issues, right? It's about what makes us stronger and a more resilient supply base. And even with CROs, you tend to have multiple CROs potentially qualified to do the same test so that you have backups. And the same concept applies to supply chain, commercial supply chain as well, right? You do for critical materials, critical tests, critical supplies, you sometimes have backup suppliers. And I haven't heard, this is something recent I heard while I was talking to CDMO, and again, I mostly worked with CDMO, so my examples are there, but similar concept. I recently spoke to some CDMO or an aspiring CDMO from the radiopharmaceuticals industry, right? Not necessarily cell and gene therapy, but equally nightmarish supply chain, right? Because they have sometimes days and hours before their isotope degrades to a point where you can't use it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that CDMO, the VP from that CDMO, he mentioned, what we're now doing is we have internal agreements with different CDMOs to act as our backups. So it's not the biotech or the pharmaceutical who has a second CDMO as a backup. It's the CDMO itself working between themselves that, oh, if we have an issue, we can do it at your site. If you have an issue, you can do it at our site, right? Which I think is a really positive step that could be adopted in a wider industry, not just within maybe radiopharmaceuticals. And the same can apply to CROs. Yes, some testing are very proprietary and one site can do it, but just as a concept, it also adds to resilience. And if you have that conversation among yourselves already in that agreement, it's also less of a tech transfer challenge than the buyer, right?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a great idea to have this sort of built-in resilience within the manufacturing network. Now, one place that seems pretty difficult is in cell therapy, because the patient is the starting material. You can't necessarily have a second of the same person as a backup. So yeah, I'd just be curious about the sort of, how does resilience play into that portion where there's only one of that specific patient?
While the patient, so yes, the patient is one, and depending on what your apheresis strategy looks like, you either have, in most cases, you have buffer as well of material, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, how would you handle an issue or add resilience? Yes, with the patient, there's one, but the manufacturing process is where you then have your, I don't want to call it flexibility, but that's then the bottleneck, right? You either have one facility, multiple facilities, and cell therapies do take up a lot of space. So it's not easy to just have multiple facilities running around dormant, not doing anything. And there's technologies evolving day in and day out, right? We know we started with the old big machines doing all the processing. You had to change disks and whatnot, to now we have enclosed systems where you put it in one end and you have the product out at the other end. And companies use various combinations of those techniques, right? Which is a technological advancement and improvement as we go, and things are going to get more and more resilient as technology evolves, right? Which then also plays into the whole cost of CGT, right? Especially what we have right now, the individual patient, one batch, and that bottleneck is there, but that's then also a calculated risk that we know and understand.
Mm-hmm. So one thing, I'm curious about your perspective on is, so I guess logistics are a big part of this, like the actual transportation. And so in the US, there's a small number of these medical research centers, which kind of have everything there. The patient can go and materials don't have to travel very far. And there's also sort of a push towards a hub and spoke model and to have things more distributed. And I'm curious how it is in Europe and what you sort of see in terms of resilience in those different scenarios.
Yeah, so in Europe, it's the similar model at the moment. Like hub and spoke, a lot of organizations, they have a main center of, a manufacturing center in one of the key locations. Some are in Germany, some are in Belgium, right? And then you have the whole distribution network or the cell collection network, which is your distinguishing factor at the moment, where the partnerships are, who you can get, whether they're global partners, local partners, all of that stuff. And then your resilience eventually then depends on the transportation in between, right? The logistics, the cold chain, the chain of identity, the chain of custody, and the technology around that to get the material on time. So it becomes the well-oiled machine, ideally, right?
Hmm.
If you make the right choices to then orchestrate all of these. And obviously, cell and gene therapy has more complexities because you need to. It's not just pick up the cells from the supply from the patient. It doesn't. They need to be processed and you just ship them back. No, there's this whole patient side of things as well, right? They need to be prepped a day. I don't know the exact timelines, but pre-dosing they have to go through mostly chemotherapies, right, to be primed for the therapy, the CAR T or the cell therapy to take effect and to have the ability to proliferate in the body. And that needs to be timed with the manufacturing process. Otherwise, you do the chemotherapy and you're like, oh, well, the supply chain or the delivery guy got delayed and now you need to do it again, right? So, which is why the supply chain in cell and gene therapy is actually your product or part of your product, right? You can't separate them from just, oh yeah, like you have in biologics or off the shelf, you can just manufacture in advance and not worry about it too much. And this is more my personal what I've started doing is, and not necessarily everybody else might have talked about or looked at it, but I do also now look at a lot of other industries. Like we have like just in time, which is a lot more common than what we have in med tech. It's more common in the medical devices, but also in the automotive industry, right? In the chips and electronics industry, where a lot of these just in time concepts are more common than what we have in bio or pharmaceuticals, right? And with these newer technologies, that might be an interesting avenue to explore as well. Like the cell and gene therapy, you already see that to a certain degree. We have a little bit more flexibility here, but if depending on how the research within the radiopharmaceutical goes, there's a lot of stuff coming now in the clinicals as well, right? Those will have those dependencies as well, and the more efficient and the more pharmaceutical as an industry can adapt around those concepts, it will become more and more resilient with that, right?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like one of the unique challenges in cell therapy is the scheduling. So, like, yeah, we're talking about a small molecule. If it's a pill, you can order it in bulk, and as long as it hasn't expired, it can sit.
Yeah.
And it sounds like one of the sort of logistical advantages of these centers is, given that this hasn't necessarily all been figured out in a super smooth way yet, you kind of need a bunch of people on call, waiting for and scheduling between doctors, patients, and so it's really advantageous to have everyone close by so that you can call and say like, hey, the cells are in, and the next step can kind of go. So it sounds like that might be sort of a bottleneck here, is having all this coordination and scheduling might be one of the things holding back really decentralized access for people who aren't necessarily close to those places.
Yes, and there's going to be a balancing act for those as well, right? You can have, I think, original idea that a lot of companies had is bedside manufacturing of cell therapies, right? Which is obviously has its own challenges if you have, given what we know now in the production areas. So you end up choosing how many of those manufacturing facilities do you want to make globally for different cell therapies, right? Even Novartis, we've seen that they have kind of transitioned a little bit towards their outsourcing their capacity. The J&J Novartis agreement came out of that because they've had issues filling the manufacturing or those manufacturing sites, right? So whether it's the location or the closeness to those centers, whether that's the bottleneck or whether it's the orchestration itself, right? I would probably lean towards the orchestration, and that the physical distance is more dependent on, the cycle time, which is what we're trying to reduce as much as possible because of the state of the patient more than right, the need for the drug to be delivered quickly. If it's like someone in, let's say, stage 1, stage 2, who doesn't have the prognosis as a late stage person who doesn't have any other options anymore, you may have a little bit more time, which might reduce the pressure of, oh, the center needs to be next door and we need to have a vein-to-vein time of 2 days, exaggerating a bit, right? But I did work a little bit on benchmarking activity within Accenture about all these orchestration platforms, right? We have the Kite Connect, the J&J has their own platform, we have the BMS 360 and all of that. And that is a key enabler, not just for the supply chain, but from a resilience perspective as well, like slotting, scheduling, if that covers apheresis scheduling, your manufacturing schedule. Uh, and we're getting into a time period where analytics and data is becoming more and more available.
Mm-hmm.
It's now about what the companies do with that data, right? We had big data, we had that wave. Now we're getting into AI, and think of AI what anybody wants. It has its ups and downs, or pluses and minuses, but from an analytics perspective, the amount of analytics that you can run with controlled AI is leaps and bounds ahead of where we are, right? Or what we can do through big data or manual extractions. And as AI matures, that is going to be a very big differentiator in resilience as well, because you can run those scenarios. It can do better, not necessarily forecasting, but anticipation of effects and events on your affecting your supply, but also in this case the scheduling. And there's this, because of the thing that you mentioned earlier, you only have one patient, so you have one apheresis, right? How you do the apheresis and the quality of that apheresis also makes a very big difference, right? And there's potential to analyze a lot of that data in terms of pre and post apheresis condition of the patient, so that you can start developing instructions and SOPs for the hospitals or the cell collection sites, that they can monitor and potentially even uh, simulate whether this is going to yield a good apheresis or not, given the patient's condition before you start the apheresis, right? Which would help also from a patient experience perspective, but also from a slotting and manufacturing, because then you go through the whole supply chain and then you find out at the site before you start manufacturing or post manufacturing that there was an issue with the apheresis, right? The cell count wasn't good or whatever the situation was. So as we collect more data, and not everybody is focused on that at the moment, but it will come,
Mm-hmm.
to start analyzing retrospectively, like the correlations between post and pre apheresis, and this then goes to post dosing as well, right? The efficacy, and what conditions give you the best efficacy, and whether we can optimize for those conditions to improve efficacy in general.
Yeah, that's a sort of great future direction to sort of wrap up on. So one thing, sort of last question I'm sort of curious about is, so with AI, one of the sort of catch-22s here is there's been a huge focus on model development and creating the systems, but really it's the quality of the outputs is dependent on the quality of the inputs. And so what a lot of people are running into is like, yeah, great, we have this system that would be perfect for a theoretically perfect data set. And that sort of becomes the real challenge is this data, one, there, and two, standardized and structured in such a way that it's useful. And I'm just curious on your perspective on the current state. Is that a new thing we're moving towards, or are companies already well sort of developing those?
I mean, I don't know if you remember from the whole big data boom.
Mm-hmm.
That has always been the issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
The whole foundation of an organization and the foundational data has always been an issue. The top technology just changed. We moved from, data lakes, cloud, and all of that stuff. Now we have AI, which has its challenges, and you see it more because there's hallucination risks, there's risk of just misrepresenting data. And there are things, and I don't want to necessarily call them technologies, with algorithms and approaches to circumvent some of that, because for big companies, it's going to be very hard to do all the master data, right? Considering we've known this issue for years now, it's going to be billions of dollars to fix all of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are solutions, and I'm no expert at that, but the things that I have seen, of course, there's knowledge graphs, which looks at tagging metadata rather than actually changing all of your data. It gives more AI a controlled environment to say, okay, this data is that, so it can identify what it is, instead of actually cleaning it up from the bottom up, right? So you have an intermediary tagging activity or tagging whole, and I'm making it sound super simple, right? But just there are intermediate technologies emerging from that to enable your AIs, and that's probably the interim solution, unless you have eventually an AI that can clean it up for you. Right? It's very unlikely that we're going to actually fix all the base data. So there's these kinds of technologies that are emerging. Hallucinations they're shown to impact and reduce hallucinations, and also have audit trails, right? Which is probably also really critical. If you don't have that audit, how do you come to that number?
Mm-hmm.
If you, I mean, I don't know how much you use AI, but I, in my personal life, have incorporated it quite a lot. I have now different AIs for different things of my life. And you notice that you need to ask it how you got to the sum of those outcomes and numbers, and where you're pulling those from, right? And those naturally incorporated into these processes are going to be able to enable the improvement in the outcomes, and also trust, right? How much do we trust AI outcomes at the moment without double checking it? You're like, I need to check.
Yeah. Wow. It's been a super insightful conversation today. So thank you so much for joining and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you, likewise, and it's been a great conversation.